Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Wednesday webinars live here from the Military Aviation Museum. We're going to be joined tonight by a speaker who is going to be speaking to us from Lubbock, Texas. That's the birthplace of Buddy Holly. You will find out, though, over the course of this evening that it was home to a great deal more history, particularly during the war years. Thank you again for joining us for one of our free programs. I'd like to welcome Sharon McCullar. Sharon is a career museum professional. She has a master's in museum sciences from Texas Tech University. It is also located in Lubbock, though she did travel widely and work at a number of museums around the country before finding her way back to Lubbock to work with the incredible collection that is housed at the Silent Wings Museum. It's an opportunity to work with an incredibly unique collection as well. So I know Sharon's going to talk a lot more about that. But she's undertaken the massive task of cataloging this loved and cared for collection that's been assembled over many, many years by members of the Glider Pilot Society that established the museum, as well as more recent collecting efforts. The museum is open. It does have regular operating hours right now in Lubbock, Texas. So if you happen to be in the area or looking for a place to make a safe trip and see something really unique, she'll talk to us more about the opening hours for the museum, but we did want to make sure that everyone was aware that it is open, the collection is available to be viewed, and they actually have been using the lockdown period to improve some of the exhibits and introduce some new content to the museum. So Sharon, I think that's probably about enough from me. Are you there?
I am here.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us this evening, and it's over to you, and it's all yours. I think we're all looking forward to learning a little bit more about a dimension of the war that we might not have been as familiar with.
Okay, thank you very much. We really appreciate the opportunity to do this and to contribute to the webinar series and boost the signal of what the Silent Wings Museum is all about. Oh dear. Okay. My name is Sharon McCullar. I'm the curator of the Silent Wings Museum. It's kind of hard to catch me in my natural habitat. I'm running around with my hair on fire and I've lost my pencil. So here's a picture of Flight Officer Bear, who is our little mascot here at the museum, who gets up to hijinks and helps us out and really helped us through the COVID-19 situation when we were closed to the public. So if you tune into our Facebook page, we have Flight Officer Bear helping us do quite a number of things and helping to provide a little levity while we're going into the very serious business of the World War II glider program. The Silent Wings Museum was established actually in 1984. On the edge of the Terrell, Texas airport. And it was established by the World War II Glider Pilots Association, who were amassing material related to their experience during World War II and wanted to make sure that that legacy would not be forgotten or overshadowed by some of the larger institutions and the larger stories. The Glider Pilots Association ran that museum as a volunteer organization until the late 1990s. And then decided that they would have to, in order to make that legacy continue, pass that institution on to a more permanent, long-lasting entity. And so the decision was made to move the museum to Lubbock, Texas, and that it would become a municipal museum operated by the city of Lubbock. And the decision to move to Lubbock was made after quite a bit of discussion and thought. The Lubbock was special to a number of the glider pilots. Approximately 80% of the glider pilots who were trained during World War II received their G-Wings, learned to fly the CG-4A right here in Lubbock, Texas at South Plains Army Airfield. And the city of Lubbock was able to offer the old municipal airport building, which was built on the grounds of the former South Plains Army Airfield location after it reverted back to the city when the United States Army Air Forces finished using it, reverted back in about 1949. And the building that you see in the picture on the left-hand side of the screen is the 1950 airport facility that now houses the Silent Wings Museum. And of course, we focus on the training of that United States Army Air Force's glider pilot and other glider personnel, and the airborne operations in which the gliders were used. Our visitors will find in our hangar gallery, of course, our restored CG-4A glider, as well as a number of other aircraft and training equipment. In our combat gallery, you'll see information and exhibits and artifacts that really home in on those 8 major airborne operations in which gliders were used. And our other galleries, Timeline Gallery, in particular, is used to tell the general story of aviation during World War II and the glider's role in that aviation story, and also to house changing exhibits on different themes that are related to the World War II glider program. The United States Military Glider Program was an integral part of the airborne strategy that contributed to Allied victory in the Second World War. American and British cargo gliders delivered infantry, heavy weapons, ammunition, construction equipment, fuel, mules into Burma, just about anything that was needed in the combat zone that could fit into that cargo space and be properly tied down and balanced could be carried into a combat zone with a CG-4A, WACO CG-4A American glider, or the Horsa British glider. Now, we like to think of the CG-4A as the modern day equivalent of an assault helicopter, with, of course, the really important difference that the ride into battle was a one-way trip. Once that tow rope was released, there was no turning back. The top picture that you see is an image of a CG-4A glider landing at South Plains Army Airfield. The training that took place here was indeed flight training for the CG-4A. They would go on after this stage and take tactical training and infantry training, learn how to fly the CG-4A with loads of infantry or equipment, learn how to fly certain patterns and certain types of landings. The brochure at the bottom of the screen is that thing that was up on the bulletin boards at the different United States Army Air Forces facilities that lured people into the glider program, made them, inspired them to become a glider pilot. And our glider pilots come from many different walks of life. Some of them were accomplished sailplane enthusiasts already. Some of them were accomplished pilots already, had their civilian pilot's license, and some of them just plain wanted to fly for the United States Army Air Forces. So they came into their experience as a glider pilot in a number of ways. A little bit about the Silent Wings Museum. We do, our educator's not able to be here today, and she's real good about talking about virtual programming, but we offer public programs. We are going to start offering guided tours at some point. Right now, we're not able to do that. We do outreach with our educator going out to schools when we're able to do that again. And we offer workshops that are related to the exhibits that we have going on in our galleries and that general theme of World War II glider program. This year, our programming for our D-Day event turned virtual. We were open to the public. We were free admission that day, but we were able to put together a social media event and able to share a little bit more than maybe we would have been able to in person. So even though some of our activities are virtual right now, they're still centered on telling the story of the World War II glider program. We have a special section on our website, the Museum from Home Digital Learning Resources portion of the website. On that, you can find things like little tutorials that our educators put together, games, artifact spotlight videos. If you're just dying to know what Sharon looks like or what our educator looks like, one of the artifact spotlights that we did for the D-Day event was to tell the story of the 2 fighting Falcons that flew into Normandy in the early morning hours of of June 6, 1944. So by clicking on that artifact spotlight button, you can get an idea of what Dorothy and I were up to make that event happen. For tonight's presentation, what I'd like to do is concentrate on the work of glider mechanics and support personnel as essential personnel of the World War II Military Glider Program. Exhibits typically take about a year to 18 months to develop, so the essential personnel part came about long before the COVID made us really think about who's essential personnel. But this exhibit evolved from the idea that there are people behind the scenes making those glider operations occur, and people that we don't necessarily know all of their names or exactly everything they did, but we know that they ensured the success of both training operations and combat operations and kept them flying during that period of time. As most of the attendees to the webinar probably know, the presentation is drawn from materials in the Silent Wings Museum collection, and museum collections are constantly evolving. So as we continue to develop resources and we find new information in those squadron histories and morning reports and period documents, there's certainly going to be more to learn about this and other aspects of the World War II Military Glider Program. So if it doesn't get covered in this presentation or when you come to see the exhibits, we hope, rest assured that we're always developing new content. And if we don't highlight your glider mechanic this time, we probably will next time. And you can keep sharing information with us to help make that happen. We're always encouraging people to share the story of their relative who was involved in the glider program. So glider mechanics filled several major roles in the support of glider operations. They were, of course, tasked with making sure that gliders were in optimum condition for flight and that repairs were made promptly. But also at those overseas bases, glider mechanics were involved in large-scale assembly operations and involved with repairing gliders in the field, depending on what they were called to do. There were glider mechanics that were actually sent out in the field to try and reclaim gliders and get them to where they could be used again. And so that MOS, which is a military occupational specialty number that you see on your screen, is compiled from a number of service record documents to just kind of give an idea of what these glider mechanics were expected to do. The artwork that you see on the screen is by a Sergeant Gregor Duncan. And we don't know what his connection was to the World War II Glider Pilots Association or the World War II Military Glider Program. He doesn't seem to be a pilot, so he may have been a mechanic or someone associated with the support personnel, and he created a number of sketches that depict life in the field. And this particular sketch illustrates what a mobile repair station looked like underneath the wing of a CG-4A glider. And we'll talk just a little bit later on in the presentation about what a mobile glider repair station was all about. Glider pilots had a really strong respect for their glider mechanics, and the training that glider mechanics got at Shepherd Field, near Wichita Falls, Texas, was very specialized training, but the glider pilots had a real respect for their glider mechanics because they understood the extensive training that the glider mechanics went through. The picture actually is scanned from a copy, so it's not the best scan of a squadron history document, and it's members of the 15th Troop Carrier Squadron glider mechanics, some of whom are identified in the squadron history document and some aren't. And the quote is from a personal account of a flight officer, Gail Ammerman, and you can, I think, from the gist of what he what he had to say about how apprehensive he was when he had to fly a glider that his troop carrier squadron, the 81st Troop Carrier Squadron, had not examined, that he was, he would rather fly a glider that they had inspected, rather than fly one that someone else has inspected. So there was a high degree of trust between the glider pilots and the glider mechanics in terms of how much knowledge these guys had and just how much they were trusting their lives to that expertise. Glider mechanics training took place at Shepherd Field, and this evolved from its inception in September of 1942 to when it wound down about December of 1944 into a very intensive training program where the glider mechanics students learned about the materials that were used to construct the CG-4A. They covered repair and maintenance of these materials, how to break down and assemble the glider into airworthy condition. And then 4 different branches of instruction really drilled down to different aspects of the CG-4A, how it actually went together, how it worked, and how all those materials interacted. And what you're seeing on the slide, on the first 2 images, are images of those Shepherd Field facilities, the rather extensive workshops that they had at their disposal to conduct those experiments and do those training exercises, break down that glider and put it back together again. And the bottom slide is an aerial view of the stockpile of CG-4A gliders that they were using to conduct that training. The picture on the right-hand side is Major Ernest LaSalle. And Major Ernest LaSalle was the, lost my place, didn't I? Was the director of the Glider Mechanics School in May of 1943. And his mandate was to expand and fine-tune the program to meet the growing needs of the United States Army Air Forces. Under LaSalle's leadership, there was an intensive course of study that produced highly skilled glider mechanics. LaSalle's program also emphasized the training of instructors with site visits to manufacturing locations and a requirement that all those instructors cycle through each of the branches of the training curriculum. These instructors were required to be proficient in all aspects of glider maintenance and repair, not just the one that they were teaching at the moment, and to continue that learning process throughout their tenure at Shepherd Field. At its peak, the Glider Mechanics School operated on a 168-hour week schedule with 3 shifts, and they fielded 191 military and civilian instructors. In total, a little over 6,000 students graduated from the Glider Mechanics School at Shepherd Field. In these photographs, you see some of those glider mechanics school students at work. The top picture is some students learning how to install inspection openings, and also, I suspect, learning how to properly apply a patch to a CG-4A wing, or really any fabric-covered aircraft. And the quote that you see is the mandate for the school. It was the directive that was printed in one of the training manuals, that their training methods were going to consist of solving practical problems and doing practical work, closely simulating actual problems performed in combat theaters. It was really important to LaSalle that his students be able to handle anything and everything that was going to happen to a CG-4A glider, because they would be on their own, especially in the combat zone. It was important for him that they be ready to do that. And on the bottom, we have 3 unidentified glider mechanics who are working on a rudder and tail section, and that is possibly happening at Shepherd Army Air Base, or it could be at Laurinburg-Maxton in North Carolina. And that's about December of 1943. So they were taking those gliders that you saw massed on the grounds at Shepherd Field and really getting into them and understanding what each of those components were all about. One of LaSalle's mandates was to create mobile glider field repair teams. And he, at LaSalle, had spearheaded this idea to take several CG-4A gliders, outfit them with specially designed workbenches and tool chests and equipment mounts in order to transport equipment and supplies to downed aircraft and or downed gliders in the field. And the idea was really well received, and LaSalle expanded the concept and incorporated into the mechanics training at Shepherd Army Air Base. They eventually settled upon packing those personnel and supplies and equipment into 5 gliders that would then go to areas that they were needed to repair those downed aircraft, powered aircraft as well as gliders. And this image is illustrating one of those, lost my train of thought, sorry. This image is illustrating one of those mobile glider field repair teams at work at Laurinburg-Maxton in mid-1943, where they have taken the equipment that's inside that glider, put it under the wing, and now they're ready to repair gliders that are being damaged in training exercises at Laurinburg-Maxton. That was at the beginning of the slideshow, and so it makes me wonder if he was present, perhaps at that. Makes me wonder if he was present at that training exercise to get such an accurate view of what was going on for that. Now, in the theater of operations, that was when the mobile glider repair teams really shone. This image is of gliders that are gathered in the landing zone, possibly Holland after Operation Market Garden, which would have been in September of 1944 for assessment and repair. Now, these glider mechanics were harassed by snipers and shrapnel from nearby anti-aircraft fire as they were trying to pack hundreds of CG-4A gliders in order to see if they could get them airworthy enough to be either snatched out or flown out for possible reuse. There were a number of crews from troop carrier squadrons and other aircraft repair units also tasked to try and repair these gliders in the field. The 26th Mobile Reclamation and Repair Squadron was a major part of the glider assembly operations at Crookham Common in England, which is also a very interesting part of the glider mechanics story. And they drew on their experience there assembling gliders to organize the repair of gliders in these landing zone operations. And here we are with a little bit of information about the glider assembly operations. The item on the left-hand side of your screen is a page from the uncrating and crating manual workbook used at Shepherd Field for CG-4A glider training to teach those glider mechanics how to properly remove the CG-4A glider from those 5 crates that it gets packed into so that they wouldn't damage it while they were getting ready to assemble it. On the right-hand side of your screen is CG-4A gliders in their crates at the Gibson Refrigerator Company in Greenville, Michigan. Now, the dock workers that were loading these crates onto ships for transport overseas weren't really worried about keeping the 5 crates for each specific glider together. Their concern was with loading the ship and facilitating quick unloading at the destination. So when these gliders arrived at assembly points in England, Crookham Common and Greenham Common were the major places they were assembling gliders for English air bases. They were also shipping gliders in these 5 crates to ports on the west coast of North Africa, and then ferrying them to training and operational bases, air bases in India for operations in Burma, and ports in New Guinea and the Philippines for operations in those areas. And so the first problem faced by the glider mechanics tasked with assembling those gliders was getting all 5 of those crates together so that they could begin that process. The 26th Mobile Reclamation and Repair Squadron was tasked with accomplishing that at Crookham Commons. Under the command of First Lieutenant Thomas Chalcraft and Flight Officer Henry Stout, the 26th MR&R activated just outside the town of Newbury, England in November of 1943. And Crookham Common was actually a repurposed golf course and had very little infrastructure. So 152 personnel, 132 glider mechanics, some administrative workers, some truck drivers, and some general mechanics were tasked with assembling what would turn out to be thousands of gliders. Many of these men were teenagers at the time and stepped up to make that work happen. These are images from Crookham Commons assembly grounds. As we said, each glider has a unique serial number, and all the components for that particular glider are in 5 different crates, but must be assembled as a unit. There was a Sergeant Jack Welburn and a Sergeant Fred Morrow who took on the task of grouping all 5 crates for each particular glider as the first step in that assembly process. Armed with 3x5 index cards and a bunch of clipboards, Welburn and Morrow imposed order on the sea of crates that you see at Crookham Common. Eventually, the assembly grounds became a fairly well-organized assembly line operation where glider mechanics were sorting out those crates, dragging them to the production line, and then moving those CG-4A gliders down that line as they were getting them assembled properly. There's a lot more information to be had about the assembly operations at Crookham Common, and you can find out much more in Leon Spencer's wonderful book called The History of the 26th Mobile Reclamation and Repair Squadron, where he took the squadron history documents and the orders that he had amassed. Leon Spencer was quite a scholar in terms of the World War II glider program, and get a very detailed view of what was happening at Crookham Common and what was happening with the 26th Mobile Reclamation and Repair Squadron. The 26th MR&R got a lot of attention when they started really getting busy with the assembly operations. And they started to find out that the crates, once they had taken the gliders out of them, were fairly well-constructed crates. Now, prior to December 21st of 1943, the 26th had lived at a temporary camp near Crookham Commons and traveled each day to their work site. But as those glider components were removed, the glider mechanics moved in. There was a Sergeant Robert Burns who established a supply room in a fuselage center section crate, which is about 24 feet long, 7 inches wide, and about 8 feet tall. And he and his administrative clerk took over that one crate and then eventually expanded it to 4 crates, and it just went on from there. There were articles in Stars and Stripes magazine and British Life magazine. These images are from the Stars and Stripes, I believe. And they highlighted this rapidly expanding shantytown and also the work of the 26th. And at its peak, shantytown had all the amenities and all the necessities of the United States Army Air Force's overseas base. It had a barbershop and mess halls, a movie theater, post exchange, all of it built with glider crates. And there were many more crates coming off the line and available for expansion in other ways. Wood from glider crates was transported to air bases in England, was transported over to France for use in building and improving facilities as they began to establish those bases later on after July of 1944. And many tents that housed glider pilots had a glider crate floor. So the volume of gliders that they were assembling just at Crookham Common and Greenham Common was tremendous. Now, ground crews are also essential personnel that unfortunately we often don't know their names, but we know that they are the ones that are literally keeping things moving along, especially when those training operations were getting off the ground, literally, and those combat operations are getting formed up. Now, there are several important things going on in these two images. The top image on the left-hand side is CG-4A gliders that are marshaled for Operation Varsity. Not sure exactly which airfield it was, but the important thing to look at in terms of ground crew on that top image is the intercom cables that are wrapped around the tow rope that you see laid out in front of the marshaled gliders. A carefully laid out tow rope was essential to even and smooth takeoff. A poorly arranged tow rope could fail to pay out properly, affect the timing of the takeoffs, and for large glider serials in these precisely timed combat operations, a small timing problem at takeoff results in chaos in the air. Also, if this tow rope is not laid out properly, that interphone cable can get tangled up and break, and they did tend to break anyway, but that's a real lifeline between your tow plane and your CG-4A. And so laying out those cables properly could at least make it more likely that those two pilots could communicate effectively with each other. The bottom picture was made also just prior to Operation Varsity on March 23rd, 1945. And it was made at Bricy, B-R-I-C-Y, airfield near Orleans, France. And it's also ground crew that are inspecting the tow ropes and doing work in between those aircraft to make sure that everything is ready for that operation to go off without a hitch the next day. Now, ground crews were well aware of the dangers of all those many tow ropes laid out, but also just all of the moving parts that were going on, all the things that were happening while the marshaling was going on, while the loading was going on. And the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, is from a training manual. I think it was Glider Tactics and Techniques, where the graphic is showing exactly where these ground crew personnel need to be on the airfield and what their job is going to be to make that takeoff happen correctly and in a timely manner. Just really important to keep those operations going. As most, I'm sure a lot of our audience are aviation enthusiasts, marshaling a glider into position on an airfield where it's dusty and it's noisy can't be done with simple verbal signals. So the ground crew that were responsible for marshaling gliders into position, and as well as hooking up those tow ropes, used hand signals. And these are training materials that were used to train those ground crew and those glider crews in the proper use of the right kind of hand signals so that they could quickly and effectively communicate both with the glider pilot and the tow plane pilot. And you see in the photograph, again from Bricy Airfield in Orleans on March 23rd, 1945, there's a ground crewman communicating with the tow plane pilot. to ensure that everything was going to go off smoothly as they marshaled that aircraft into position. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about specifically the ground crew and the role of glider mechanics as essential personnel for the United States World War II Military Glider Program, as well as the opportunity to boost the signal about what the Silent Wings Museum is all about. What you see is our social media channels, so we're hoping that you'll be interested in following us on Facebook and hopefully coming to see us. We're open to the public the hours that are shown, and we'd like to see you.
Sharon, if you would please just leave this up on the screen during the Q&A portion. I think it's a great thing for people to have the opportunity to write the location down. I can't recommend this museum enough. When I first went to work for the CAF and I was out in Midland, one of the first road trips I made was up to Lubbock to go see the Silent Wings Museum. And I've always been impressed by the just incredible story that you all tell, but also the incredible quality of the displays and everything that are assembled up there in Lubbock. So can't recommend it enough for everyone. Sharon, if you've got the time, we've certainly got many questions.
Oh boy, okay.
Sharon, you mentioned that Silent Wings is located at the site of South Plains Army Airfield. The reason that this all ended up in Lubbock was a specific historical connection from that airfield and its role in training glider pilots. Could you talk a little bit more about the operations there in Lubbock during the war?
Sure. South Plains Army Airfield was established in, oh goodness, someone's going to catch me out on this, May of 1943. And at that time, it wasn't, May of 1942, it wasn't the primary advanced glider training base. There were glider pilots being graduated from the glider program at Victorville, California, and Stuttgart, Arkansas, and other places. But it was quickly decided as the glider program evolved that we needed one central location to funnel the glider pilots, student glider pilots through, teach them how to fly the CG-4A, and then advance them on to the other aspects of the training program. So by mid-1943, South Plains Army Airfield was declared the primary advanced glider training base. And so the final count is about 7,200 or so glider pilots trained during World War II, and around 5,800 of those glider pilots got their G-wings, graduated from the advanced glider training in World War II. So it was a really familiar place to the World War II Glider Pilots Association and had a really strong connection with them actually becoming glider pilots.
Sharon, you mentioned that the combat role of gliders is often compared to the kind of modern role of an assault helicopter, of carrying troops and equipment into frontline combat, oftentimes in support of large-scale airborne operations. Can you talk about how many people could be carried in a glider, but also what kinds of equipment tended to fit in those gliders?
Sure. It was commonly called, in fact, some of the design specifications call it a 15-place glider, which means that you can seat 12 airborne troops on the benches inside the glider, and then there's a jump seat that folds down on the other side of the egress door in the cargo area. So that makes 13 passengers and then a pilot and a co-pilot. CG-4A weighs a little over 3,700 pounds, 3,750 or so, and it can carry its own weight in cargo. So those 13 troopers plus the two pilot and glider pilot could have enough equipment and stuff with them to be about 3,700 pounds. Properly balanced, they could even handle a small crawler tractor, a CA-1 Clark crawler tractor, which is an automatic overload for the glider, but reinforce the floor a little bit and you can get that crawler tractor in there. It could handle a 75mm howitzer and I think 18 rounds of ammunition, and its 3-man crew. It could handle a Jeep and a couple people in that Jeep and one on the jump seat. it could handle 3 mules with the right kind of stable situation or stall situation in it. You carry gasoline in jerry cans. You can pile in as many bicycles as you wanted to. Just depending on what you were needed, and it was properly tied down and balanced, you could get up to that 3,700 or 4,000 pound weight limit.
Sharon, glider pilots didn't often have the luxury of sort of waiting there with the glider as the infantry on board went off into combat. And I've heard it said that the G actually stood for guts and not glider. Can you talk a little bit more about the realities of being a glider pilot in combat?
Sure. The glider pilots did get some infantry training when they, in conjunction usually with their tactical training at Laurinburg-Maxton, the tactical flying training. They would go over to Bowman Field and Camp McCall and take infantry training. But they knew very well that once they were on the ground, they were going to attach themselves to the glider infantry that they had just carried in. And the idea, ideally, once that glider pilot safely landed his glider, he was expected to get to a gathering point or a command post and be processed out of the combat zone, ideally, because he might be needed to fly another glider serial or be ready for another operation. In reality, they tended to get attached to their glider infantry and served with those guys until they could get to a gathering point. So there was a real mutual respect between the glider infantry and the glider pilots, because the glider infantry knew that it was the glider pilot who was going to get them on the ground, and then they would be, the roles would be reversed, and the glider pilot would be relying on the glider infantry to help him out.
In some ways, the climate out in West Texas kind of lends itself to glider training. There's a lot of thermals and hot air rising, and it allowed the training gliders to stay in the air for quite a while. That was substantially different from the experience in combat, where the glide ratio of a fully loaded WACO was perhaps not what people had wanted it to be. In your research and everything for this exhibit, have you found any stories of glider pilots being kind of unprepared for the realities of trying to fly them into farm fields in the darkness of night and all those kinds of operational limitations?
Sure. I think a lot of glider pilots were pretty open about, in their personal accounts and in the oral history interviews they did, that they had trained with night landings. They had trained at Laurinburg-Maxton with Mike Murphy's obstacle course to hop over that fake hedgerow. It wasn't the hedgerow that they were expecting in Normandy, but the idea of hopping over that line of trees and getting into that tight landing zone. But those landing zones, as rough as they kind of made it at Laurinburg-Maxton, were not the Rommel's asparagus laid strewn glider poles. They're poles that are planted in the landing zones to thwart glider landings. I think a lot of them, they were prepared and they knew how to fly and they knew how to land. But yes, the idea that that first landing in the combat zone, where they released and really had to be on the ground in 30 seconds, was a very scary proposition. And there are a lot of glider pilots who went back for more and earned, 5 air medals and participated in all 5 European operations. And they were pretty free in their oral histories and in their personal accounts that they wrote for the museum, that it wasn't something that they were wholly prepared for until they actually had to do it. And then they just did it.
Sharon, you mentioned that a lot of the gliders were destroyed on landing, nosing over, hitting ground obstacles. But there was also a mechanism by which they could be field recovered. A tow airplane could pick them up out of a field by snagging a tow cable, similar to how a banner is picked up by a banner tow airplane. How much was this really done operationally? What was the kind of ratio at which these were written off after a single mission?
That's a good question. I was shown a report, and of course I couldn't cite it off the top of my head, but I was shown a report when I first started here that predicted or put out the kind of the mandate that we're going to retrieve 25% of the gliders in the landing zones. We're going to send these mobile repair teams in and send these mechanics in, and we're going to be able to retrieve 25% of them. And that number probably was never quite reached, because once they started gathering up the gliders and assessing them, they were finding that they were cracked up on landing, they had structural problems. Some of the landing zones they weren't able to get to for a week, 2 weeks, maybe even a month after the operation was done. And if you've been occupied and at war for 4 or 5 years, like the people of Holland were, that CG-4A looks a lot like the wheels to a farm cart. It looks a lot like a chicken coop, and it looks a lot like a new roof with the glider fabric. And so they were used for other purposes, so that the actual number of gliders that were refurbished and actually snatched out is probably less than the 25% that they were anticipating.
It's certainly an interesting thing, looking at their projections for those large-scale airborne operations and how reality lines up. And definitely, I think it's well understood that glider fabric makes a tremendous roof repair material. That all being said, the CG-4A that's in your museum, did it see service during World War II? How did the museum come to display such an artifact that had such a high combat attrition rate?
Yes, the CG-4A that we actually have several components, a couple cockpits and a partial, but the full CG-4A that we have on exhibit in our hangar gallery wasn't one that actually went to Europe. She was one that came off of an assembly line and then was pretty near the end of the war. Serial number is from a contract date in 1945, 1944, late 1944, early 1945. And so she never went overseas. She was one of those that they stopped manufacturing, didn't know quite what to do with it perhaps. And she was purchased by a business in Fresno, California. And she was put on top of a tire store in Fresno, California, and had Armstrong tires painted on the side of her. And that's when the Glider Pilots Association noticed it and caught a hold of it in the early 1970s and refurbished it. So our CG-4A never flew in combat. She's a conglomeration of all those bits and bobs that the Glider Pilots Association were gathering together, built onto that core glider that was on top of that tire store.
I think one of the things that most intrigued me from my trip to Silent Wings was actually being able to see what glider tow cable was made out of at the time, and understanding how expensive it was to produce that tow cable and how prized and valued they were, even leading to the Army Air Forces being told to fly back over the Allied lines through the flak and everything before you drop the cable, because we need to be able to recover them. Can you talk a little bit more about the tow cables? And I guess there was a special team that specialized in recovering them there at South Plains Army Airfield.
Yes, and there's a panel about that in the exhibit, which I thought was really fascinating. The tow cable is actually nylon. It's an 11/16" thick nylon cable. I believe it's 1,500 pairs of nylons in every 350-foot length of tow cable. And there's hardware on either end of it that then connect into the tow release mechanism that's on the front of the CG-4A and in a fairing or a cowling on the back of the tow aircraft. And so, yes, they were fairly precious in training operations in South Plains Army Airfield and other training locations. Typically, the tow aircraft was to fly back over, like you said, a drop zone in a safe area. And then a crew was sent out to retrieve those cables, wheel them in, and then take them back to a shop and then inspect them and repair them and then reuse them. combat operations, they did have designated drop zones. Might not have retrieved all of those tow cables, but tow ropes rather. But they definitely had a designated drop zone because they were really quite expensive to produce and had a particular effective life, 2 or 3 uses, and it would be stretched out to the point where it doesn't have enough give to safely tow a CG-4A glider for a long period of time.
Allied, you mentioned that the British Horsa glider was used by America, and of course we were Allied. What conditions led to the use of the Horsa? Was there a shortage of CG-4As? Was the Horsa able to perform different functions? Can you talk a little bit about why it is we ended up, using those British style gliders as well?
Sure. I'm not for sure on the number of Horsas that were made, but they were constructed very differently. The Horsa is made almost entirely of wood. It's a wooden glider. It's also much bigger. I believe its passenger load is 26 troops, I think. It's about 20 feet longer than the CG-4A, and its wingspan is, I think, about 5 or 6 feet wider than the CG-4A. So it's bigger and heavier than the CG-4A. And it was the British answer to the cargo glider. It was something that their designers came up with and were able to manufacture there in England. Not necessarily better, just different than the CG-4A. And the British glider pilots also cross-trained on the CG-4A. There were British glider pilots specifically in North Africa prior to Operation Husky that trained on a CG-4A. So they were able to fly each other's gliders, although I think it's fair to say that the British glider pilot regiment pilots preferred to fly the Horsa, and the United States Army Air Force's glider pilots preferred to fly the CG-4A. But it was just the British answer to the problem of developing a cargo glider.
You mentioned there were 5 drops, I think, in Europe. There was also a glider operation in the Pacific. Is there anything in the museum that covers the glider landings in New Guinea?
We do. We have it. We have it on our timeline. We have an exhibit case that we rotate artifacts, but there is an area in the combat gallery that does address the operations in the Philippines and in New Guinea.
Excellent. We've just got a couple of questions remaining here. You mentioned that the museum was an outgrowth itself of a Glider Pilots Association from the war. How active does that association continue to be? And approximately how many glider pilots are out there remaining in the world today?
The World War II Glider Pilots Association made a transition I think it's about 3 years ago now, because the number of veteran glider pilots in that organization were dwindling. So they made a transition and became the National World War II Glider Pilots Committee, a committee of the Silent Wings Museum Foundation Incorporated, which is our support organization. So they're very much an active part of the Silent Wings Museum. They support the work that we do. There's a research team that does a phenomenal job of helping me to understand certain aspects of the glider program. I can always ask them for a little bit of information. Some of your folks might be familiar with Charlie Day, who is the guy for the CG-4A glider. And so they're very active in helping us to continue to communicate with the families of glider pilots, with descendants, and helping us to make sure that we've got our history right. On their roles, on the Glider Pilot Committee roles, I believe they have about 20 known glider pilot veterans that are members of the association. There might be members of the committee. There might be others out there in the world that we just don't know about, but about 20 of them left in the world.
Certainly fewer and fewer every year. It's great that you have access to that resource and are able to capture those stories. Sharon, can you tell us a little bit more about the process by which one would become a glider pilot? Was it an assignment? Was it a task that you volunteered for? Did people join the military specifically to become glider pilots, or were they already infantrymen? What was the sort of general process?
Okay. The general process is that they came to it as a volunteer. Everyone that was a glider pilot was a volunteer. There were a number of power pilots closer to the end of the war who were strongly encouraged to take the glider training and become glider pilots, and they flew as co-pilots in Operation Varsity. But the glider pilots did have to volunteer. The general process was for someone to join the United States Army Air Forces and start the basic flight training. There were a number of them that took civilian pilot training program courses and became pilots even before joining the United States Army Air Forces, and had a little bit of a jump on those that just wanted to fly and join the United States Army Air Forces. There were a number of people that had joined the infantry and made a switch and became part of the United States Army Air Forces because of either an affinity for flight, or they saw that this was an opportunity for them to learn how to fly. So they tended to come into it at least with an enthusiasm for flight, or an enthusiasm for flying for the Army. Many of them took college courses as part of college training detachments and came into the United States Army Air Forces that way. One of the advantages to becoming a glider pilot, one of the incentives that was offered in that brochure that was earlier in the slideshow and some of the other promotional materials, was that they would make you a flying staff sergeant. And as you were progressing through the glider pilot training program, you were a staff sergeant. And then when you earned those G-wings, you would become a flight officer. And so there was an incentive there to become a glider pilot for that reason.
Thanks for answering that, Sharon. Our last question for this evening is going to address the type of tow aircraft that were in use. You showed several pictures that included C-47s, but there were some other more unusual airplanes that towed gliders, both operationally and back stateside. Can you talk a little bit more about those different tow platforms and which ones the glider pilots preferred?
Okay. Yeah, the C-47 was the main tow aircraft. We have one that is on loan from the National Museum of the Marine Corps out in front of the museum to illustrate that main tow aircraft. The C-60 Lodestar was used at South Plains Army Airfield, and it was perfectly capable of towing a CG-4A. It could tow up to 3. There were at least one, maybe I've seen one picture anyway, of a triple tow attempt at South Plains Army Airfield with the C-60. So that did happen. There were other aircraft that were checked out to tow the CG-4A. Just about any 2-engine aircraft was capable of doing that. They checked out the B-24 and the B-17, and I can't remember all the letters, but there were a number of 2-engine aircraft that were checked out to be able to tow the CG-4A, but they were allocated to other missions, and it wasn't really feasible to allocate that kind of aircraft to glider tows. The A-25, a little attack aircraft, was checked out to tow the CG-4A, and the P-38 was checked out to tow the CG-4A, but they, and I'm not a pilot, but the stall speed for those two was too high, and the top speed for the CG-4A was too low, and it was too fast, and the CG-4A really couldn't handle that speed, so they didn't use those. But they did check them out, and they did say they could tow a CG-4A.
Well, Sharon, that concludes our Q&A period for this evening, and therefore the presentation. Thank you so much for your time this evening and for sharing all this great information about the glider program. Could you perhaps tell us where we might find more information about the gliders? What are some great sources that might be usable to our volunteers and our members whose curiosity has been piqued by tonight's presentation?
Sure. The National World War II Glider Pilots Committee maintains a wonderful website all about the World War II glider program. They have a number of articles that I should have put it on our slide. They have a number of articles that have been produced over the years, and they are definitely the go-to resource for basic information about the glider program. Their website is fairly simple. It's WW2, the Arabic number 2, gp.org. So World War II gp.org. And they've got a number of pages on each of those major operations about the men themselves, the CG-4A itself. And I believe we have a link to that on our silentwingsmuseum.com as well. You can find it. They're a very good resource for that.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you again, Sharon, and thank you to everyone at Silent Wings that continues to do great work keeping this story alive and accessible to all of us. So thank you to everyone who's joined us here this evening, and we look forward to seeing everyone at the same time, same place next week. Thank you so much.